This episode of Our Gen Pod is brought to you by a grant from Family Nation and by listeners like you. Thank you. I'm Julian G. Simmons, and this is Our Gen Pod. Hi, everyone, and to those of you who are new to our podcast, welcome. When we started Our Gen Pod, our description was by, for, and about baby boomers. We wanted to create a podcast specifically about the 55-plus audience like us. And although it is important to talk about issues and interests from our perspective, the more we got into looking into those generational divisions, baby boomers versus millennials versus Gen Xers, the more we realized that these divisions don't really help anyone and actually hurt all of us. We are facing some serious problems: global climate change, deepening divisions between the political right and the left, a dangerous threat to democracy, a growing gap in wealth, and the emphasis is on the we. We are all in this together. We need to work together and stop pointing fingers at who's to blame. So that's the direction we're taking. We're looking for solutions to our common problems, ways to get along while still coming at it from the perspective of the older generation. Because, after all, we have been overlooked and underserved and ignored, but our goal is to find positive answers to the negative threats that we're all facing together. Today, we're specifically taking a hard look at how we've been divided up into those warring camps like baby boomers versus millennials. Our guest is Professor Bobby Duffy, the director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, whose most recent book, The Generation Myth, knocks down those walls with solid research and has come to some bold conclusions. So here's my conversation with Professor Bobby Duffy. Hi, Bobby.
Hi.
Welcome to our Gen Pod. For our listeners, I'm going to just tell people who you are, and you are the Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And you've worked in many areas of public policy for over 30 years, including the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. What is the Strategy Unit for our American listeners?
It's so the strategy unit looked at big picture issues for government, trying to look further ahead, I guess, not just at the immediate business of government. What I actually looked at was understanding life satisfaction and trust in other people and how that related to what government was doing.
Tell us how you ended up in this profession. I mean, what was it that was so fascinating to you about? Some of it, people would roll their eyes going, oh my God, all the statistics and the numbers, and well, how do I make sense of that and how do I make it interesting?
Yeah, I suppose I've always been interested in evidence and how, particularly on how society works, and then even more particularly on how people think and their attitudes and values and identity and how that relates to their behavior. So I've kind of always had an interest in that. In terms of my study, it was quite mixed, with quite a focus on literature and storytelling alongside more data-driven and methodologically and statistically driven areas of study. So I've always liked the interplay between those two things of how do you understand the world and the mix of evidence and stories that people use to understand themselves and the world.
But the reason we have you on the podcast today is because you've recently written a book called The Generation Myth.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us what that title means exactly? I mean, what is it you're trying to say with that?
Yeah, I suppose if you're trying to sum up the book in a sentence, it would be that generational thinking is a really big idea that some of the biggest thinkers in philosophy and sociology think is really important to understand society. But that idea has been horribly corrupted by a whole series of stereotypes, myths, and cliches about different generations. So the myth, there's not one myth, it's a whole series. It's like a never-ending stream of myths and stereotypes about different generations, which cloud the real changes that are true between generations. There are differences between generations. Generational change is one of the key ways in which societies move forward. But that's kind of lost in this mess of myths and cliches. So that's the job of the book, is trying to separate the myth from the reality by not just proving or disproving something as generational, but trying to understand the real root cause of the change that we're seeing. Which
Why do you think the myths are? Why do they persist?
Yeah, there's many reasons. I think that fundamentally humans like to tell stories about ourselves, and these labels become very useful shorthands that simplify a very complex world, about who we are, which group we are in, and who we're not, who the other group are. So I think there is a sort of natural appeal to us of these types of simplifications. But then there's also,
is it good? Is it a good thing?
well, I mean, no, I think there's a definite downsides to it. So there's partly because there's also a second effect, which is some people are motivated to exaggerate differences or change between generations because there's money to be made, or there are clicks to be got on extreme stories in social media or the media. So you have got people who are motivated to accentuate the differences between generations, and that's why we've seen such a huge number of myths or cliches around millennials killing lots of traditions that people like, or ridiculous things like millennials killing the wine cork industry, or all of those types of things. And then at the other end of the age spectrum, baby boomers ruining things, ruining the planet, ruining everything, really. So you've got, I think that sort of stereotyping is destructive and dangerous about how we see each other. The connections that we have between us are put at threat by that stereotypical view of other generations.
Mm-hmm. So, well, right now we're doing a series of episodes on civility or the lack thereof, and just to help people understand more what it means to be civil in society and why it's so important. So, how does that relate to the generation myth, would you say? Civility intergenerationally, is it a problem?
Yeah, I do think it is. I think anything where you've got this weight of stories that are caricaturing generations as doing a particular action, which is like the killing theme, or that they are utterly different from each other. This accentuation of around things, around culture wars, of this is a generation of snowflakes who are, or social justice warriors who have very different views from people who've come before. That creates a sense of distance and conflict between generations on this. We may not fully believe them, but it does affect our view because there are so many of them. And I think that's combined with a second really important trend, which has been a real age segregation over recent decades in a number of countries. So we have in countries like the US and the UK, older people have increasingly been living in suburban and more rural areas, and young people have been sorted into cities to a degree that we've not seen before. So there's a lot of talk in the US about this being a dangerous experiment in age segregation.
Uh, I know you've also said with social media, for example, the way baby boomers, Gen Xers use social media, which is not nearly as much as what a Gen Z would or
Mm,
any of the younger groups, that also perpetuates this
mm.
division, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you've got this physical separation into different spaces that is very much mirrored in a digital separation where people are on different platforms doing different things between the different generations, and because our digital lives have become more important in our lives overall, that digital separation is also important. I mean, there is one of a very strong set of evidence around contact theory in sociology, which is that good contact between groups is very important for understanding and connection between them. The actual being in touch with people, seeing them individually, seeing them in real life situations, is really important to avoid that sense of distance between people. There's people that you can think you are very different from when you and have very opposing views to. While it's very easy to have that type of very aggressive, not very positive interactions with them online, when people are actually in touch with each other and in a physical space, they're much more polite and measured and can see the other person's point of view. So we are losing contact in not just the real world, in the physical environment, we're losing positive contact in the digital world in more considered ways. And that is a worry because it is a very strong piece of evidence that when you lose that contact, you're much more likely to think less generously of the other side because they're not as humanized to you. They are more abstract, and you don't know people from that group, and that is across the generations. That is a worry, and I think explains quite a lot of the increasing sense of concern or the worry about generational war or conflicts is we just don't come into contact with each other as much as we used to.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because, and I think maybe it's not just even intergenerational, because if you here in the US, for example, over the presidential election,
Mm,
the things that people would say to each other that I would see on, for example, Facebook. And in our own, we did a survey on civility and we asked our listeners a lot of questions about what they thought were the issues. And 85% of our listeners who responded to the survey said civility is an
mm.
issue. On Facebook, for example, the things that people would say to each other, and I would think, well, would you actually say
Right.
that to someone if you were face to face with them? I mean, I suppose some people would, but the majority of us wouldn't. We wouldn't dare talk to someone like that in person.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that's exactly it. It's much easier to dehumanize someone if you're not in their presence and don't see them as a full person, and that is much easier in this digital environment.
So, speaking of tribalism, for example, how we like to stick to our own groups, does that empower us, do you think, more in a negative way than a positive way?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, there are definite positives to being part of a group and having a sense of identity. I think there's nothing immediately wrong with having that. I mean, it's really important to humans to feel you are part of a group. We are social animals, and that sense of connection to others is really important to us. I guess it's more where our identity is set up against other people's identities, and you've got an in-group versus out-group dynamic, and that sense of distance and polarization is the worry. So there's lots of research around how increasingly polarized we are becoming, where we have a worldview that is very different from the other group's worldview, and we think that that's the right one and they are wrong. And you can see that in trends in the US. There's a Pew Research that they call the moving mountains chart, which just shows Republicans and Democrats drifting apart as two mountains that overlapped quite a bit in terms of their attitudes not that long ago, but now are utterly separate in terms of their general social or political attitude. So yes, I think being part of a group is not necessarily bad. It's when it's set up not just for itself but against other people, and that's where it becomes more difficult.
So is there a difference between, say, my perception as a baby boomer or my individual perception?
Mm.
I mean, where is there an overlap? Are they different or are they the same? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you mean your group identity and your individual identity? Is that what you mean? Is
Yeah.
there a yeah? I mean, look, the baby boomers are a huge cohort of people who have massive variation, obviously, in terms of circumstances, behaviours, attitudes within such a vast swathe of the population. So this is what I use in the book is this three-way split of what explains attitudes and values and behaviors and how they change, which is, one of them is a generational effect, a cohort effect, where you will be more similar to baby boomers in some ways because you were brought up at a similar time. And we know that that formative experience is really important in how we're more malleable in those early adult years, late teen and early adult years. You will have some sense of cultural connection. We kind of get that instinctively, but you also have life cycle effects where you change as you age, and people will be going on different life courses depending on their experience during their life. So that kind of varies people's experience. And they also have period effects where things happen generally and change the context for people. So you end up with a very rich mix of these different effects explaining change and a lot of variation within generations. Things like economic outcomes, there's more variation and inequality within baby boomer generations than on average across generations, because that's just the way it works. So you will have things in common, but you'll also have significant differences, and we need to look at the whole picture, not just focus on one aspect.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it is especially true in the United States because we are such a mixture of ethnicities. And in the late 1800s into the 1900s, up until the war, we had this huge influx of immigrants. So when I was growing up in the 50s, I spoke Polish as a child because my family came from there. And so everything that surrounded me was very ethnic. The schools were Polish, everything. And this is in the United States. So you end up in this kind of little island within a big country. And I recognize it very clearly now in this country, for example, with the Latino population. We have this very large influx, especially in California, of Latino immigrants, and they live in close communities. And I'm sure that what you're saying plays a part in what our perception is of the society that we're living in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, going back to civility, I want to talk for a minute about what part the media has in portraying different groups in society. For example, I've noticed that older people are almost absent from television in this country, which kind of perpetuates that dissociation between generations. But I don't see it so much. I watch a lot of British television and I don't see it so much there. It's much more integrated. Would you say? And how does that play out in society as a whole?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the direct comparisons of US, UK, but the trend is, I think, the reality is it's the same. It's the same point that older people are underrepresented in the UK media outside of particular types of drama or particular types of shows. So yes, there's very solid evidence that and in things like advertising in particular, there's a dearth of older people, and when you do have older people in those types of media, it is quite often a cliched view of them. That you've got those 7
Right.
stereotypes of older people, from the very fragile end up to the golden ager image of, but nearly all of media coverage fits into these stereotypes, which is problematic. So it's not only underrepresented, it's also, they are more negative than positive.
Yeah, because they're very negative for the most part. I mean, looking at that, I mean, curmudgeon, severely impaired, or John Wayne conservative. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a strange list, but it seems to fit to how, and it's a sort of bit of a, I don't know, it's a bit of a paradox still that we're very aware that we've got an aging population. We're also aware that baby boomers, on average, have significant wealth and consumer spending power, but still advertisers and commercial organizations generally do not have a very sophisticated offer or appeal to them. And we've known that for decades, and it hasn't changed very much. It's got a bit better, it has changed a bit, but it hasn't changed nearly as much as you'd expect. And that's interesting. We've still got that negative association with age, that when people are portraying a lifestyle or a brand that they want you to connect to, they will naturally go to younger people rather than older people to get that point across.
I understand what you're saying, Bobby, but there is this other side to it, and that is there's been research done about how old people feel. Do they really feel their age or do they feel younger? And generally, people usually feel about 20 years younger than they actually are.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
if that's the case, I'm sure that there's been a lot of psychological analysis done within advertising, like how do we target the audiences we want to reach? And maybe, I don't know this, but maybe that what they're doing is they're saying, let's make them young because people feel younger than they actually are. They never relate to their real age, most of the time at least.
Mm.
And so when they see someone younger in an ad, it's more appealing to them than if they see someone older.
Yeah, agree.
As well as the fact that usually when we see older people in ads, they're handicapped, or it's about retirement, or it's about health insurance or life insurance or something like that, or stock investments. And it's generally all about being old as opposed to just being a human being.
Yeah.
I'm sure that some of what we're dealing with younger generations, they're more impressionable. They like ads is one of the things that I remember, is that they're impressed by ads. It's whereas opposed,
Mm.
as you get older, you get kind of more critical of what you're watching. And in fact, I don't like watching ads now at all. But I remember when I was younger, I thought it was kind of fascinating. I'm sure that some of what we're dealing with younger generations is that they are still formulating who they're going to be. And a lot of that is a big experiment. It's
Yeah.
funny because I remember when I was 14, there was this movie that came out called Wild in the Streets. It was about this guy who was running for senator. He wanted this band to help him promote to younger people. And then they decided, well, we want to change the voting age to 15. And so the young people take over the country. And when I was watching it, I thought, oh, this is so great. This is how I feel. It's like
Yeah.
we should be running things because they don't do anything. And so I
Yeah.
recognized myself in the book from way back then, thinking, okay, I understand this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. That is an age-based trend. That is an age-based explanation. Young people, quite rightly, always think the older people have done it wrong, and we need to come in and do it better. Equally, older groups. It's a constant of history that older groups always think the new generation are the worst ever. The new generation of young people are weird and wrong, and that's like really natural. That is one of the things to kind of get your head round, is that it's not just natural for society for there to be tension between young and old. It's actually essential for society to have some element of tension, because older people we get set in our ways once we get past our formative years to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree. And you need that new generation as an injection of some of the academics call it demographic metabolism, that we got this sense we need that refreshment so that we don't stagnate as society. So there is something very healthy in having tension between generations, because if we didn't have it, we've probably stopped evolving as a society, and that's not a good thing.
So, based on that, is there an overlap between civility and the generation myth?
Uh, how do you mean? An overlap?
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me, for example, is that when I was growing up, some of the things that I rebelled against was sort of the order of things,
Mm.
that you did things a certain way, especially when you were out in
Yeah.
public or whatever. But as I got older, I realized the things that I was rebelling against were also the things that I relied upon to keep my life in order.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, at least my perception of it, is been erased. The
Yeah.
kind of order of things. And I think it was especially true even in the UK, whether it was a class structure or
Mm.
things like that. But
I see what you mean.
it hasn't been replaced with anything. There's chaos in the world, and I think part of that is that people are acting out because they don't have. I think most people are used to somebody telling them what to do
Yeah.
or how to be, and if they don't have that, they just kind of run amok.
Yeah. I mean, I'm okay. So I would say, as us as people who are older, should naturally feel unsettled by the change that young people are bringing through. If we didn't, like I say, that would show that things probably weren't changing enough. So the sense that we feel that things have gone downhill is probably a a good thing, and kind of utterly natural, but is more to do with life cycle than it is to do with this generation being particularly good or bad on things. I think it's a really interesting point about civility, because I because what on the one hand we will feel that traditions and ways of living that we held dear or we thought had useful purpose, young people are tearing up or ignoring. And again, that's natural. Then on the other hand, you've also got quite a counter trend of things that were acceptable in our day are no longer acceptable in terms of how culture or issues have tended to evolve. So the sense of offence that people take to particular issues or use of particular terms, or the way that language has been linked to people's sense of harm, that what people say can hurt you, was probably much less developed in our day. So that we've got these countervailing pressures where on the one hand we may think that standards have decreased in terms of civility and how people interact with each other. On the other hand, you've also got this increasing policing of speech, or that sense that speech is increasingly important to how people react and feel. So it's a really interesting tension about what is civility in that sense, about whether it's about how you address people, not assuming which pronouns to use, versus the politeness potentially of losing that politeness to more directness of the kind of social media communication styles. So I think like everything else, civility and people's understanding of it constantly evolves, and younger generations may have a different view of what that means to them. In fact, they're inevitably going to have a different view of what that means to them than what we did, what we grew up.
Right. I personally see a lot of the issues or problems we have with civility are coming from social media and the press,
Mm.
that they are constantly now going after sensationalism
Mm.
as opposed to telling us what the facts are.
Mhm.
You talk a lot in the book about that we tend to deal more with the now, which
Yeah.
in a lot of ways is good, but we also are very short sighted about the future. Like the
Mhm.
statistics that I was reading about climate change were disturbing.
Mm.
So, what is the media telling us? I mean, it's almost like everything is a TikTok video, it's a sound bite. But what do we do about
Yeah.
short term thinking?
Yeah. No, I think short-termism is real, and we have we definitely have a short-term bias, and it's very much a human it's a human capability to be able to think long term. We're a very unusual species. In fact, maybe the only one that can imagine a future and work towards it. It's a proper, in terms of long-term future. So we can do amazing cathedral level thinking, but it doesn't come that naturally to us. We have to really focus and try to do it. And we keep getting drawn back to the short term. So it's not that the capability isn't there as humans. In fact, it's one of the things that distinguishes us. It's just it doesn't come naturally to us. And then, unfortunately, we have an environment in the economy and politics, in media and everything that really is very short-termist. Political cycles don't fit with the type of long-term challenges of climate change, economic cycles, demand from shareholder to have results immediately, the immediacy of media, as you say. It's no longer 24-hour news turnaround periods; it's in seconds. So those types of changes all bring it much closer to those short-term views, which is really terrible for the long-term issues that we have, which includes climate, but also inequality, so many other aspects of what is the future of work, are all these very long-term things that don't fit well with our systems, really. So, yeah, that is one of the big challenges I wanted to flag in the book, because we need more of that generational thinking, that we are not just living out our lives and then done, but we have a sense of legacy across generations.
I worry that the media is manipulating that information so that they are subconsciously telling us that we don't need to worry about these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure in some sense, there is strategy within media that is connected to big business, etc. But in many ways, we get the media we crave because they give us what we want, and they play to those human biases. So in the other book I wrote on misperceptions, you got to think of it as a system where the media play to our biases, but they only do that because we've got those biases
in the first place
already.
Yeah.
So it's a very human system interaction.
There's one thing I want to get to quickly, and that is the deaths of despair.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stuck out to me, especially with here in the United States, was this statistic about white males 45 to 54 who were without a degree.
Yeah.
And they're having a higher incidence of suicide. And there's also, I'm sure you know, here, as I was reading, something called diseases of despair, which is related to that, which includes a gamut of symptoms, including things like reckless driving and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when I read that, I was thinking about the constant issue we are faced with here with people who don't want to get vaccinated, or people who were involved in the January 6th uprising at the Capitol here in the United States, or Trump supporters just refusing to believe fact.
Yeah.
And if there is a correlation between what you're talking about there and those statistics and this type of person, and I'm not pointing a finger at them, I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, I think the good work on this, there's lots of good work on this in the US, and what it points to is there's no one cause for both the death of despair and the uprising, but there are some common themes where a lot of it is got economic outcomes related to it, but really at its core, it's about a feeling of a loss of a way of life and a loss of respect for that way of life, people leading that way of life among those types of groups, the white, male, lower educated groups, where they used to be able to expect a decent living and a sense of respect. So a lot of the work on this talks about not just your consumption ability, as in how much money you're making and all those types of things, but your sense of contribution to production, that you're important to the economy and you're important to
that you have
society.
Value. Yeah.
You have value, yeah. So really about, is your way of life valued anymore, your individual contribution? And I think that seems to be pointed at the root of a lot of this. And then when that happens, when you've got that sense of loss of respect, you get much more resentful about other people coming in that you feel are getting preferential treatment, whether that's immigrants or other groups. And so that adds to that sense of tension. So it's partly economic, but it's much broader about loss of way of life and loss of respect. And that they kind of tie together that deaths of despair with that sense of uprising against the system, and whether it's working for them, and where that's where you get populist leaders, that's where their support comes from. Those people who feel like they've not got much to lose.
Right, and someone helps them blame somebody else for it, whether that's realistic or
Yeah,
not. Individualism, you talked about individualism starting pretty much with Thatcher and Reagan.
yeah,
Is that a big problem for us as a society now, individualism?
yeah. It definitely is. But yes, no, yes, a long trend towards individualism, not starting with Thatcher and Reagan, but certainly accelerated with them. And I think that sense of it's all down to the individual and there's no collective responsibility has changed. Younger generations have a different view of what help they can expect to get and whether collective action works as well as individual action. And I think that's a risk. I think again, big things that we face like climate change are going to be a lot about collective action to deal with them, not individual action. We will need to work together as societies and have real change in the economy, for example. So, yes, I think there's a risk in this long trend towards individualism that we think we're on our own, and that will stop us dealing with some of our biggest challenges.
So, as a civil society, we're in relation to everything that you've learned through doing the Generation Myth and your work over the many years. Where do you think we are as a civil society? Are we in a good place?
No, not really. I think not in a great place. I think the other work in that more in that sort of space, things like Bob Putnam's book, The Upswing, shows how, across, in America in particular, how across the 20th century into the 21st, that you had a kind of low points at the beginning of the 20th century in the Gilded Age and that sense of inequality, and then it got better in the second half of the 20th century where there was growth but also social connection, and now we're back in a period that feels more like that lack of growth, growing inequality, and loss of connection. So I think there is threats to it. I think what my work shows, though, is we're also not. It's not as dire as it seems from what you see in the media and social media. The trouble with what we see now is there's a real incentive to accentuate the extremes, the most extreme reaction on one side or the other, because we know from all the experiments on this that travels further and faster than other types of information. People click on that and share that type of stuff. So we've got this impression of a really fractious community out there of one side against the other. When the reality, when you do the more careful measurement of where people are, is much more nuanced and there's much less distance between people on lots of issues than you'd expect from that rhetoric. So it's not in a great place, but it's not as bad as you may be led to believe by what we see. And I think we need to keep that in mind as a kind of hopeful final messages on this, is that it's we have been through similar situations like this before and worse, and we have an accentuated view of how bad it is now. And we've certainly made things better in the past. So we still have the capability, the agency to change things for the better.
So, is the danger also that myth can become fact? For example, parents taking their children to school basically started here because there was danger lurking around every corner if a child walked to school. I walked to school when I was a kid, and nothing ever happened to me. But it seems now this accepted norm that these dangers are there all the time. So parents are, driving their kids to school all the time. Is that based on a myth? How do we differentiate in our own lives between what is myth and what is fact?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think there is a risk that the rhetoric becomes self-fulfilling. In the polarization work, on all the theories about how do we become polarized or very different from each other, there's a distinction between whether you're polarized on the issues, whether we have different views of the issues, or whether we're polarized just on our identity, or affective polarization, it's called. So the worry is that we can create a sense of division. I'm on one team and you're on another, and we don't like each other, even if you don't really disagree on the issues. And that's the worry here, is that that type of rhetoric, that type of stories that we tell ourselves, give the impression that we're really divided, when actually, when you look at it, we're not that divided on the issues at all, but our identities tell us that we should be fighting against each other. And that's the thing that we've got to guard against in all this, absolutely.
In closing, one other thing before you go, your book, The Generation Myth, what does it tell us about where we are, what we can do? Is there something in there that tells us what we can do as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. At an individual level, I think it is mostly about taking comfort from the fact that there is no big division between young and old, not in the way that it's often portrayed. And the main thing that I'm encouraging is that that separation between generations that we kind of drifted into by accident, just through inattention, living much more separately. That doing our best to reduce that is maybe the key thing that we can do. Trying to get contact between the generations is something that we can do as individuals, but something government and civil society can do too. I think those types of spaces are really, really important. And that would be my one main message, is make contact with across generations. Try and do that yourself. Try and do that more systematically across the system. And that benefits both sides. There's very solid evidence that both older people get real value out of that in the same way that younger people get value out of that. So it's a very efficient way to improve society by making those types of contact.
So the point being then that we have something we can work with, that there's something, we might not have all the answers yet on how we can make those connections, but the intention to know that that's what we need to do is very helpful.
Great.
Bobby, thank you so much, Professor Bobby Duffy. We really appreciate you spending the time with us today, and have a wonderful life.
You too.
Thank you so much. Listening to Bobby Duffy makes me wonder, what can we do to bring more unity, understanding, and change to what seems like an increasingly fractious world? Most of us know people older and younger than ourselves. Sometimes it's friends, sometimes our regular checkout clerk at the store, people we see at the gym, or our parents, or our children, our grandchildren. In all these cases, we have the power to effect positive change over how other generations see us or how we see them. We all have a chance to be more inclusive, kinder, and more understanding. We can all gently start to knock down those barriers between different generations. In upcoming episodes, we'll be looking at some of the organizations and individuals who have made that their mission. You can learn more about Bobby Duffy and his books by visiting us online at ourgenpod.com. That's OURGENPOD.com. And please take a moment to like and follow us on your favorite podcast platform and tell your friends how they can listen in too. We also welcome and appreciate your financial support. It's definitely needed. Please go to our website and click on the donate button to support our work at www.ourgenpod.com. And be sure to subscribe to our mailing list to stay in touch. There's also a place where you can share your comments by adding your voice to the conversation. Just click on the microphone icon on our website and record your message. We really want to know what you think. In closing, I want to take a moment to thank Rob Wilson, our phenomenal director and editor, for his work on each and every episode, and to the talented Bill Aldridge for his Our Gen Pod theme music and other music. You are the best. I'm Julian G. Simmons. Thanks for listening.
Unless otherwise noted, all content in this podcast is copyright unauthorized films. This podcast includes copyrighted material, which has not always been specifically authorized by the copyright owner. This content is used only where it is the specific subject of commentary by us and our guests as part of our effort to advance understanding of issues of social and historical significance. We believe that this constitutes a fair use of the material in accordance with the Fair Use section of U.S. Copyright Law Section 107, which reads, "The fair use of a copyrighted work for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research is not an infringement of copyright." Further information on this claim of fair use may be found on our website at ourgenpod.com.